you've all bumped into organizations that are less than authentic. You've all bumped into organizations that in their lobby, in a beautiful framed and matted thing, have these wonderful corporate values. And they're amazing things. Truth and integrity and service and value and quality and inclusion, and those things hanging on the wall don't have anything to do with how that organization operates. They don't have anything to do with how decisions are made. They say that they're this thing, but they're actually this thing over here. Now, we've all got a little bit of that gap in our life. But if that gap gets too big, you end up in a very, very crazy place. You're not even living in reality anymore. And one of the things that it does is it compromises your ability to make good decisions, because you think that you're this thing, but you're actually this thing. On the individual and the organizational level, both those things play out. A quick story of how this and it's an extreme example, but it's an example of how this can kind of play out and be very costly to an organization. On February 1st of 2003, Space Shuttle Columbia was coming back to Earth. It had been up in the air for about 2 weeks on its 28th mission, and about 9 o'clock in the morning it was re-entering the Earth's atmosphere, and it basically disintegrated over Texas and Louisiana. Some of you probably remember where you were when this happened. It was one of those kinds of stories. It was a national tragedy. 7 astronauts lost their lives. And when this happened, NASA immediately shut down the Space Shuttle program, and they put together a serious accident review board. Right? And the Accident Review Board had a lot of authority and power and resources to investigate, to analyze, to study, to learn as much as they possibly could about how and why this happened. And the Accident Review Board very early on knew what the mechanical or the physical cause of this disaster was. When the Space Shuttle had launched on January 16th, about 80 seconds after it took off, a piece of foam had broken off the external booster rocket. About a suitcase-sized piece of foam had broken off the external booster rocket, and it had hit the front edge of the left wing of the space shuttle. It actually hit it hard enough to create a small hole. Spaceship goes up into space. It does its 2 weeks of mission. When it's coming back to Earth, when it's re-entering the Earth's atmosphere, when it's exposed to crazy amounts of heat, the front edge of those wings get almost up to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit when it's coming back into the Earth's atmosphere. Because that wing had a hole on it, that heat and those gases were able to come inside the wing, and that's what led to the demise of the space shuttle. So they knew very early on physically what had caused the disaster. But when that Accident Review Board released their final report, they had some very strong things to say about the organizational culture at NASA. Very early on in that report, you can find this statement. In our view, the NASA organizational culture had as much to do with this accident as the foam. Pretty profound statement, I think. People had died, right? Some of you work in organizations where a lot of people downplay the significance of culture because it's this touchy-feely, fuzzy, intangible thing, and we can't measure it, and we can't inventory it, and we can't put it in a box, and all of those things are true, but this is a reminder that culture is a powerful, powerful thing. It's always running in the background. They went on to say this. NASA's initial briefings to the board on its safety programs espoused a risk-averse philosophy that empowered any employee to stop an operation at the mere glimmer of a problem. Awesome, especially if you're NASA. If you're any organization where safety is paramount, where you have to have a safety culture, you want this to be true. But there's a really important line that comes right after this. Unfortunately, NASA's view of its safety culture in those briefings did not reflect reality. NASA was not the organization that they claimed to be. There was a difference between what they said and what they actually did. A few specific examples of that gap. One of the things that NASA said, that they've always said, is that all voices are equal. And again, if you work in an organization where safety is critical, that's really important. You want that to be true. But when the investigators went in and spoke to employees, they found out that actually the reality is the higher you are in rank, the more important your voice is. Right? Those are two very different things. We say one thing, but we actually do something different. Another example. Another one of the things that NASA has always said is that if you have a safety concern, you should share it, period. And again, if you want a safety culture, that's kind of important. But the reality was, it wasn't safe to actually share a safety concern unless you could prove it. And those are two very different things. Two very different things. One final example. Another one of the things that NASA has always said is that safety of flight is our most important priority, our number one concern. When they went in and talked to employees, they found out that actually staying on the flight schedule was the most important thing. That's the thing that drove behaviors and drove actions. So here you have an example of an organization filled with incredibly smart people. None of this happened because there weren't smart people involved. Incredibly smart people. You have an organization that said one thing but did another. And that gap compromised their ability to make good decisions. The people that were in charge of that space shuttle mission were not making decisions based on reality. They were making decisions based on fiction. Right? If you're in charge of the Space Shuttle Columbia project And you know that on January 16th, the space shuttle took off and there was a piece of foam that hit the front of the wing. But you believe this is the organization where you're connected to. This is the organization that you're part of, where all voices are equal. If you have a safety concern, you should share it, and safety of flight is our most important concern. If no one has said anything to you on January 17th and January 19th and January 22nd and January 25th, all of these smart people involved in the project, if no one has said anything to you about it, why would you have any reason to believe there was anything to be concerned about? The problem was, this isn't the organization they were a part of. This is the organization they were a part of. Right? And so the consequences of this in the long term are significant. Right? In the short term, not so much, but in the long term, they are significant on both the organizational and the individual level. Now, as organizations and as individuals, we all have a little bit of a gap between what we say and what we do. None of us are perfect. We're never going to be perfect. The only problem is sometimes we convince ourselves that there is no gap. Sometimes organizations convince themselves that they are the things that are hanging on the wall. And when you convince yourself that you're there, it's kind of hard to be about the work of closing the gap. And so part of our conversation today is just about making sure that we know where that gap is, taking a look at what is it that we say, what is it that we do, how big is the gap, now how do we close it? How do we try to close it and make sure that we are living and leading in a more authentic way?
Now, it's easy to recognize, when you hear that story, it's easy to recognize how the breakdown in authenticity, or this breakdown in doing and saying, shows up here, right? It's pretty easy, but it might be harder to recognize that in your own organization or in your own team or your own life. Because it's hard to, it doesn't feel like most of us aren't launching spaceships in our day-to-day life. Most of us do stuff that's much more mundane than that. And so I think it's important to step back and really take a harder look, because in most of our organizations, these same disconnects are happening every day and in lots of different places. And we need to pay special attention to that. And I want to talk about meetings for a minute. Because I think meetings of people is where we see and recognize probably the outages of authenticity most vividly. It's where authenticity is probably most sorely lacking. I want to share a story from a number of years ago, back when I was still in my corporate HR career. I was at an organization leading an HR team where we were proposing to make a fairly significant change to our corporate benefits program. We had a solution in mind that would have saved, or was going to save, both the organization and our employees pretty significant cost savings. It was a pretty cool idea, but there was a rub. The hang-up was that the organization, one of the organization's larger local clients, was a local health system. And there was the potential that if it was implemented and not handled the right way, that there could be some potential risk or impact to this client. And so I was confident that we could manage our way through that we could handle it and make it a win-win. But my boss was nervous. My boss, the CEO, when I told her about it and shared the solution, she was nervous. She's uncertain. And so what she proposed was, she said, well, I'll tell you what, let's have a meeting, let's call together all of the different folks from inside of our organization who interact with the hospital or the health system, and you can lay it out for them and we can talk about it and see where we land. And so I did this. I called the meeting, invited people together. And so the day of the meeting shows up. And my boss had told me in advance that she had another meeting and was going to be a little bit late, but told me to go ahead and get started. And so everybody gathered. I started the meeting. I laid out the solution. I laid out the potential benefits to the organization and to our employees. I laid out the risk that we believed was there. I laid out some ideas for how I thought we could mitigate it, how we could sort of work to make this a win-win. And to my surprise, the people in the room actually were nodding their heads and they're like, yeah, I think we could make this work. And so we were starting to move into a conversation about, okay, how would this look and what would we do to make it happen? And my boss had showed up towards the end of that. She came in kind of quietly, sat down, and sort of listened to the conversation for a little bit. And then she spoke. And what she said was this. She said, I'm just really concerned about the impact that this could have on our relationship with the health system. And as if by magic, the opinion of every single person in that room, except for me, changed. Within 5 minutes, we had arrived at a decision that we were not going to move forward with this year. It was just too risky, and we might revisit it at some point in the future. It's to this day still one of the most stunning things I have ever witnessed in a boardroom. And so let's step back for a second and think about that experience, because I am fairly certain that if you were to go and interview my former boss and ask her about how the organization makes decisions, big decisions like this, she would say, well, we're very participative. We ask for feedback, we involve people, we make collective decisions. And I would also place a pretty large wager that she would point to that meeting as an example of how we make group decisions. Now, if you're on the outside looking in at that meeting, you're going to arrive at probably a very different set of conclusions, much like the Safety Review Board did at NASA. But you know what, even worse than that is that in that room that day, there were probably 8 people. And I think the bigger sort of violation or travesty is the abuse of talent in that room, because there was probably 8 people in the room that day. How many people needed to be there? 2. Because in hindsight, what I realized was that my boss never for a moment considered that this was going to happen. It was dead the first conversation we had. But she wanted to avoid the conflict with me. And so she called the meeting fully expecting that everybody else would come to the same conclusion and tell me there's no way we're going to do this, but it didn't go that way, so she ended up having to tell me no anyways. Think about how profoundly wasteful that is of the perspectives of the other 6 people in the room. Right? When we aren't fostering, when we aren't leading with authenticity, when we aren't making room for authenticity, think about when people can't make their full contribution, when they can't contribute their opinions or their ideas, think about how much we lose. Right? Thankfully, that day we weren't launching rockets or making life or death decisions. Right? We were just talking about money. And so, authenticity is critically important. And it's critically important not only to our decision-making quality and the speed and quality at which we can make these decisions, but it's also really getting in the way of our ability to innovate, to create, to move with greater velocity, and it is killing employee engagement.